Hello, I'm ready. I am ready. I have now officially taken over. Welcome. I'm not sure if you know me. I am Lucy Haze, the biggest Polish trans streamer. And you know how it is in the US. I don't know if it's in Canada like this, but in the US, if the president falls, the vice president takes over. So this has happened now. President Sunday has fallen, and the vice president Lucy rules now. It is my time. And to prove my point, I'm gonna open the stream by taking the HRT, okay? A blocker and an estrogen. She has assumed control of the mainframe. True. And it's basically like the same stream, right? You have the books, you've got everything. So it's as if nothing has changed, really. It's basically the same thing. You won't feel the difference. I believe. I've got water. Nom. Nom. I have prepared a big topic for today. And also, I don't have it with me, but I have purchased an 19th century Torah with a Yiddish translation. It's from 1837. So I have gained a big book recently. You know, a very old one. It needs some renovation, but I believe. In reality, Lucy is in the same room as President Sunday. You just moved the camera. True. That is true. Is Lucy also acting as Nana replacement? Wait, does Nana need a replacement? If they need a replacement, I'm there. You have an ancient tome, that's right, in a language that is endangered. Yiddish. I'm also starting to learn Yiddish, just so you know. You might wonder what's today's topic on the agenda, and I will tell you. You might have been told that in Europe, we have no racism. And that's a lie, of course. How many of you are familiar with the Roma population? Raise your hands if you've heard of the Roma population. It's a permanent revolution. Lucy rules through direct support of the people. True. True. That's why I had to dethrone President Sunday. You could very well say that the president has been dethroned by the trans lobby. We have dark councils now. That is true. So, have you heard of... I also know how they often victim of racist discriminations. That's true. Did you know that the Roma people, much like Jewish people, were the victims of the Holocaust? Some Roma people were even trapped in the ghetto together with Jewish people. Did you know? Like from 50% to 70% of the population. That's right. Hello, Palm Dad. And we're gonna go back a little bit further than the Holocaust. Have you heard of the slave trade? Have you heard of the slave trade? That is an important question, a question that any American will not have a problem answering. Have you heard of the transatlantic slave trade? Which slave trade? The transatlantic one. Indeed. Well then, did you know that Roma people were a part of the transatlantic slave trade, and that within Europe, Roma people were enslaved even before the transatlantic slave trade? Are you familiar with the topic? Transatlantic is only slightly more well known than the cisatlantic. True. That is true. But I am here to remedy that. So we will start with watching and discussing a video. I've got a video for you. So, you're not Christian, therefore it's legit logic. Sort of, yeah, I guess. Let's watch. L&D is not with us today, so we will sadly yeet L&D, okay? That is sad, but unfortunate, but real. Actually, I had a really big blood sportsy debate with Ellen DeGenerate lately, so I encourage everybody to watch it. As in, watch that thing. Bird milk, open, paste, European history, a reaction. Oh my god. We take this here. We kick things off with this. Ready? Ready or not? Here I come. Kind of. There are debates. What was the original reason of the enslavement? There are competing theories out there. I would think it's probably because of the visible otherness of the group, because the group did not have its own homeland, which is usually easy to exploit. Jewish people have found themselves in a pretty favorable situation within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by striking a bargain with the nobility. But keep in mind that much like the Roma, Jewish people have had a difficult history, especially in places like Western Europe. Religion might be one factor, but other factors such as visible otherness could be, yeah, I think so. They're also nomadic, if I remember correctly, which makes it also easier to make them disappear. Which, interestingly enough, much like Jewish people, have stricken a bargain with the nobility of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so have the Roma people actually also stricken a bargain with the nobility. And within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Roma people had their patrons, which were from the nobility, and they were assigned an estate, which was considered their home or home base, so to speak. And so Roma people were allowed to live a nomadic lifestyle, and the only requirement for them to be allowed to do it was to appear in their home base from time to time and bring goods and services that the nobility really enjoyed from the Roma population. So it was sort of like a give and take sort of arrangement. But we're not here to talk about that. We're not here to talk about my favorite topic in the world, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We're here to talk about the enslavement of the Roma people. So this is exactly what we're gonna do. I'm starting the video. A Roma family through European history. Talk series for the House of European History. This is to set the tone of what I would like to talk about today as our topic. And I think this will be very informative, as I suspect that many people who are especially from the US or Canada are not super familiar with Roma people and their struggle. Okay, I would like to say this before we even start the whole thing. Roma people, as a community, as a people, are in a very sad predicament. I guess that is one way to put it. A lot of Roma are no longer nomadic. A lot of Roma people were forced to settle down. But that's a whole other topic. You could say that not only are Roma people persecuted to this day, they are also a forgotten people in many respects. How often do you hear about the Holocaust that happened to Roma people? Roma people actually have their own name for the Holocaust from the Second World War. And I'm gonna actually ask, how many of you have learned about the genocide of Roma people at school during World War II? Was that even a topic that was mentioned, let alone discussed? Was that a topic? My guess is not. Because Roma people in Europe and probably around the world are treated as a group with so little political and social capital that they are treated, on the one hand, they are marginalized, discriminated against, and treated as second or third class citizens. And on the other hand, which might seem paradoxical, Roma people are also treated as invisible. Roma people are treated as a group that does not exist. Their suffering does not exist. Their trials and tribulations, they do not exist. They are a very uncomfortable group for the entirety of Europe to discuss. And honestly, the main thing that happens to the Roma population is discrimination. There have been no reparations for the genocide that happened during World War II, as far as I know. And I guess this is as right as time as any to start us into the video so we can understand more. In Poland, Roma people were forced to settle during the communist era, by the way. Just so you have the context of the entire thing. Okay. Let's go. Enslavement and oppression.
I didn't know that Roma were slaves. I was surprised when I heard that we were for 5 centuries slaves. From 14th century to the 19th century, 500 years. I did a theater piece called Ziganiade from the author Ion Buredeliano. Through this theater production, I had a new view of our history of Roma repression.
Actually, the word that she's used is a word that is replaced with Roma. It is considered a... Well, it is basically considered a bigoted word now. The C word in European languages.
And why in Romania a lot of Roma still suffer from poverty. This minority has not the access to education. The racism and the exclusion from this minority is still very high in Romania.
And I will add that in places like Poland, Roma people are often faced with homelessness, ostracization. Like, a lot of Polish people think that it's okay to be openly racist against Roma people. Like, you have to have this context to understand just how difficult life is for the population all over Europe. My father's subordinates, many years ago, my father's subordinate invited me to a meeting, like a fireplace with food. We went to eat something. His friends were there as well. And during dinner, they were openly exchanging stories of bigotry against Roma people as if it was some kind of a nice, funny thing to just exchange between friends. They were talking about riding past Roma homes and screaming and shouting at them. They talked about all sorts of bigotry against Roma people openly and proudly. And suffice it to say, it was my first and last meetup with them. But the fact remains that in many situations it is still treated as acceptable and normal, quote unquote, to treat Roma people as lesser than. And Roma people are associated with poverty, homelessness, theft. There were a lot of stereotypes that said that Roma people don't want to work, that they want to steal. Theft is a huge one. And also, I took part in a funded project to help Roma people that involved conducting interviews with them. And of course, in Poland, Roma people are also associated with people who come into the subway, the trams, and the buses with an accordion and gather money from the passengers. Not to mention the long list of slurs that are often mistaken for her actual name, as many always heard all of those. So yes, I guess I grew up seeing Roma people a lot around the city. I grew up sort of being surrounded by Roma people in many respects, and I even have a little bit of I even have a little bit of a strange anecdote story about Roma people. When many years ago, as a young teen, I was riding the tram, and for some reason I was upset. I don't remember why. I was very, very upset with something. And then a Roma family came into the tram and they played the music and went to gather the money from the passengers. And there was a young boy in the family. And for some reason I stood up and started dancing with the boy from the family. And we've danced to the tune of the accordion for a couple of stops. And then we just sort of, bowed to each other and this sort of thing. And we went in our separate directions. And that's basically it. That's the story. That's the story of me dancing with a Roma boy, which was roughly, he was roughly my age. All right, let's continue with the video.
Romania and in other European countries. In the 15th century, Roma were deported from the colonial power Portugal to Africa and Brazil. In 1540, England began to expel Roma that they have used as slaves. These Roma migrated to Wales, Scotland.
Right, because England got a new source of slaves.
And Scandinavian countries like Finland and Estonia. During the 15th century, the Roma, as an abundant people, were subordinate to the imperial rules. This meant they could be expelled, raped, or hunted at will, without consequence. My grandfather fought in Serbia in the First World War and he survived. He was a veterinary doctor, but nobody knew that he was Roma. My great-grandmother was working together with him as a nurse. When the Gadge found out that he is a Rom because someone overheard him talking in Romani, they hanged him and my great-grandmother in front of their children. They were very rich at that time. All of their belongings went to the government. In Austria and Germany, there is a very famous saying.
See, like, and I have to stress this. I cannot stress this enough. Bigotry against Roma people is normalized. It's so normalized that people don't see it. People treat it as normal to be bigoted against Roma people.
Alles ins Haus. Wäsche, Hühner, Kinder. Die Zigeuner kommen.
In English it means, bring everything in the house. Laundry, chicken, children, the gypsies are coming. This sentence originated when Maria Theresia, the Austro-Hungarian Empress, between 1740 and 1780 tried to force the Roma people to a permanent settlement.
This is very interesting. This is very interesting timeline.
She also wanted to assimilate the Roma, and she took the young Roma boys, and gave them to the Gadge. This Gadge used these young boys for hard work and to send them in the war. So their own biological son could stay at home and survive the war.
Right.
Some Roma families tried to take their children back. They wanted to rescue them from the Gadge. And at that time, this urban legend comes from that gypsies will steal your children. Nobody mentions that these were their own child. The Roma families were even punished with hanging for the stealing of their own children.
This is very interesting because, as I have mentioned, the Roma people had a very special arrangement with the nobility of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you might not realize this, but right before the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth died as a country, it created a thing called the 3rd May Constitution. The 3rd May Constitution was the second constitution after the US one. And it's very, very interesting. You might be interested in hearing this. Roma people, under the constitution of 3rd May, were assigned citizenship and were made regular citizens of the Commonwealth just as everybody else. They were given full citizen rights. They were made equal with everybody else in the country. And then the partition of the Commonwealth happened between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And all of those rights that the Constitution gave the Roma populations were stripped away. The whole constitution was undone. So for a brief moment, in this part of the world, Roma people were given full rights, but it was all undone.
Maria Theresia, the Empress, did the preparatory.
Because against Roma was so normalized where I was from that I thought Roma racism humor was just anti-poor humor because there was no other form of racism around. Yes, Roma people are heavily... there's a heavy sort of this connection that people have about Roma people with poverty.
Work for Hitler with the forced settlement and the forced registration of the Roma here in Austria. My grandfather graduated from high school, and this was very unusual for Roma. He hated Roma, even he was also a Rom and very dark-skinned. When I was a little child, he forbade me to play with the Roma children. He always said harsh things about the Roma. He forbade my mother to talk in Romani in the house. But just when he left the house, my mother and my grandmother talked secretly the language. My father learned Romani from my mother. I think my grandfather was like that because he saw his own mother and his own father hanged for being Roma. He was just 12 years old. And we're not talking about ancient history. This happened just 70 years ago.
Yeah. People often don't realize, people often don't register that all of these things that people treat this as ancient history, just like the lady said, as something that happened so long ago that it's almost insignificant. You know? Okay. So now that we've same thing was typical of Native Americans, right? Now that we have the context, we move on to read an article. Big and important article. about the slavery itself, written by Margareta Matache. Years before fast sailing ships with enslaved people from Africa made it to the shores of North and South America, the Roma people on the territories of modern-day Romania had already been forced into a system of chattel enslavement. My ancestors were among them. You see? Roma people were put into a system of slavery within Europe before a wider intercontinental system of slavery had been established. Now, a follow-up question. How many of you have heard of the Roma enslavement? How many of you have heard of the Roma enslavement? And better yet, how many of you have been taught about it at school or any other education system? I know about the Roma. I didn't know they were enslaved. I had no idea. I have not. Nope. I heard only of the Slavic enslavement, but I knew. Right. And this is why I think this is an extremely important topic to talk about. Because as I've said before, Roma people are a forgotten people, which, as much as it's paradoxical, they are, on the one hand, the most persecuted group in Europe, I think by far, and on the other hand, Roma. And on the other hand, the most forgotten people in Europe. I'm surprised Balkan explorer that the genocide of Roma people from World War II is discussed. Many people in the chat have said that they have not heard about it before. The Roma people are not actually... The Roma people actually are not from Rome. As much as the name is similar, Roma people are not from Rome. The Roma people hail from a region within India. At least that is what the historians say. Okay. Today, this 500-year system of exploitation and domination of Roma remains utterly forgotten. See? A forgotten history. In Romania, see? Romanian people are also often mixed up with Roma people, and that is a bit of a problem. And in the global history of slavery, race, and racism. So as the article says as well, Roma people are both persecuted and forgotten about. Because with many peoples, and I think this is important to talk about, I think this is important to stress, with many peoples, you have discrimination, you have you even had genocide. But for those people, their history is something that is recognized and talked about. Although the US in some states is trying to rectify that, like Florida is trying to change its history around slavery. But I think that's a whole different topic. Like at the end of the day, it is not possible to make the history of slavery in the US forgotten. It is impossible to make the history of the genocide of Native Americans forgotten. It is impossible to not talk about these things at all and to make this history just forgotten. But the history of the enslavement of the Roma people has been made forgotten. I think this is a very, very important thing. Well, Iran used to be called Persia, quite literally. Keep that in mind, Yonska, that Iran used to be called Persia. It's just rebranded into Iran. They hailed from today's Rajasthan state of India, most likely. As I recall correctly, it had something to do with, if I remember correctly, the Roma territory within India was taken over and Roma people themselves were pushed out of the area, which I guess bears some similarity to the history of the Jewish diaspora, right? If we are to think about it. Yes. Keep reading. Roma people were coerced into the system of chattel enslavement beginning in the 1370s. Or perhaps earlier, by three types of enslavement: the crown, and later the state, the Orthodox Church, and the nobility. By law, the enslavers owned the slaves as their property or possessions, and slaves without a master would become the property of the crown. So very insidious system in which either people had a private owner or were just the property of the wider crown. In the Romanian territories, the Indian origins and skin color of the Roma made it possible to distinguish them as non-Romanians and non-Christians. Ethnic distinctiveness or race was one of the original reasons for enslaving Roma. So we have here the answer to the question from earlier, where someone asked, was it because of religion? Partially, yes. But also, it is because of the otherness, the visible otherness that I have mentioned. The color of the skin, probably different outfit, probably different customs, etc. Thing that enabled to otherize the group and discriminate against them. Just to contextualize, if this enslavement happened around 1370s or earlier, while in today's Eastern Europe the death toll was less, we're talking just decades after the peak of Black Death. The institution of slavery ended in 1855. 1855. This is a staggeringly recent time. 1855. It is staggering just how long this has went on. In Moldova in 1856 and 1856 in Wallachia. After the final act of abolition in 1856, the 250,000 Roma slaves who became legally free, some 7% of the Romanian population received no reparations for the inhumane treatment they had suffered. Well, it was a mixed list of reasons for why the Roma people were targeted. There was the religion aspect. There was the visible otherness aspect. The difference in how Roma people looked, acted, presented. Because keep in mind, Andrew Blood, at the time of when the slavery started, nations, as we understand now, did not exist. There was no such thing as a German nation, French nation, Polish nation, etc. in the 1370s. We did not have such concepts back then. So it could not have been people of other nations because the concept of nationalism or nations did not exist as we understand them today. As also happened on other continents, after 5 centuries of exploitation, the abusers received monetary compensation for freeing their Roma slaves. Okay, I'm not super well versed on US slavery history, but did US slavers also not receive compensation for freeing slaves? Was that a thing in the US? Just answer me this. Did American slavers receive compensation for freeing black people? I think so, yeah. Yes, most were compensated, I believe. In the UK, slavers received compensation for freeing slaves. I'm going to be quite honest here. If you will allow me for a moment of honesty, I think it's ridiculous, right? Especially in the US. Because, okay, let's put it in perspective, right? In the US, the Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862. There was some slight compensation during the Reconstruction period in the US by President Ulysses Grant, but at last it was also undone. Okay, that's good. After all, keep in mind, the slavers just lost a civil war. They should have not gotten anything. Okay? If anyone should have gotten compensation, it was the slaves. Was the compromise because, economical damages. Andrew Johnson in the 1870s undid a lot of progress being made. Like, keep in mind, and this is, I'm gonna say, even though I cannot prove that it's factually true, but I'm gonna say it's factually true and correct. Economical damage is an empty argument because if you would have recompensed the slaves, they would have entered the economy, and they would have been the force to countrywide. The freed slaves would have been the people to sort of fill in the economic gap, if that makes sense, by creating companies, entering the workforce, and doing all those things. And during I'm pretty sure when we were sort of celebrating the Juneteenth on my channel this year, we learned that actually Black people did very well economically right after being freed. And then the government started doing redlining and other Jim Crow things, right? I'm pretty sure that at first, actually, Black people did fairly well in organizing economically. They even bought a whole park to celebrate the Juneteenth in, and it's actually a park that exists to this day, and it's sort of for celebrating the Juneteenth. But, the little progress that people started making after being free was quickly undone in the name of, white supremacy, really. Separate but equal, right? Right, correct. Okay, well, let us continue with the history of the Roma. The slaves were somewhat compensated with legislation in the Freedmen's Bureau established in 1865, but Johnson undid a lot of that positive progress, leaving a lot of Black people lost and unhelped. Right, yeah. And then you went into active discrimination. And active discrimination, which we feel to this day, as in the Black community feels to this day. And people sort of, that's right. So we have here the slaves were the means of production themselves. They were a loss of productive investment. Their value was based on future ROI. It's quite disgusting. Okay, so the abusers received monetary compensation for freeing their Roma slaves. October marks 635 years since the first written attestation of the enslavement of Roma people in Romania. In October 1385, Dan the first prince of Wallachia and an enslaver gifted to the Tismana monastery 40 Roma families, among other assets. So as you can see, Roma people were just treated as assets. Let no one tell you that Europe does not have a problem with systemic racism within it. It absolutely does. It absolutely does. Year after year, this date has passed unnoticed and unacknowledged, while Romanian institutions and the Orthodox Church have shown little interest in taking responsibility for Roma enslavement. In fact, I will say that the entirety of Europe sees little interest in uplifting and supporting the Roma population. Like, this has to be said, this has to be talked about. Okay, I've been given a good link. about October 1385. We're going to do a little bit of a detour into the Enslavement Act. The Slave Compensation Act of 1837 in the United Kingdom, signed into law on 23rd December 1837. I guess this is sort of like today's stream is a little bit of a research stream about Roma people. With Slavery Abolition Act 1833, it authorized the commissioners for the reduction of the national debt to compensate slave owners in the British colonies in the amount of approximately £20 million for the freeing of slaves, based on a government census of on the 1st of August 1834. More than 40,000 awards to slave owners were issued. Since some of the payments were converted into 3.5% government annuities, they lasted until 2015. Most were sold and the money sent abroad for investment. Do you see? So basically, people had slaves, and when slavery ended, the slave masters, the slavers were just rewarded for the enslavement of people. The slavers were rewarded. Okay. Year after year, this date has passed unnoticed and unacknowledged, while Romanian institutions and the Orthodox Church have shown little interest in taking responsibility. This disregard is not surprising given the pervasive anti-Roma racism in Romania and elsewhere in Europe. This is good that they are... this is good that the person is saying this, because as much as this article focuses on Romania, this is a continent-wide problem. Racism in Romania and elsewhere in Europe. This has to be said time and time again. We need to show solidarity to our Romanian, sort of like, well, not Romanian. See, I did the mistake now. We need to show solidarity to our brothers and sisters that are Roma, okay? Because I think their emancipation is within our best interest, you know? Because I believe our fight is the fight for the emancipation for all groups that are discriminated against. Roma slavery has been denied in Romanian history books, while global cultural and knowledge production rarely mentions it. See, once again, Roma people are the forgotten people. They're forgotten by history, they are forgotten in discourse, they are treated as this group that is to be discriminated against, that it's normal to discriminate against. At a recent online event on race and racism organized by the Romanian Cultural Institute in New York City, for example, several attendees engaged in invalidating the Roma enslavement and equating it with the experiences of Romanian serfs. Some historians have gone as far as arguing that the Roma were lucky to have been enslaved, as this system helped them maintaining their identity and protected them. This is, of course, incorrect. This is, of course, extremely incorrect, because we have countries where the Roma situation was better than in places like Romania. I've already mentioned the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in which the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a very specific country. The nobility, which was the main ruling class or estate within the country, had various dealings with various groups of people. And they had a special arrangement with the Roma people that allowed them to live a traveling lifestyle and to be under a protection of a specific noble, which you will agree is a better arrangement than being protected by being a slave, right? Not to mention that the Third May Constitution made Roma people just full-on citizens of the country. Apart from these dismissive voices, countless progressive Romanians continue to perceive the process of truth-telling about Roma enslavement as a threat to the image of Romania. The treatment of Roma depended on if they were in favor with the local noblemen. That's an accurate description of the situation. Hello, content sniffer. In much Europe. True. There is nothing worse that you can do than to try to protect the image of a country. What you need is an honest look at history. You do not want pleasant history full of lies. So people that say that the process of truth-telling about Roma enslavement is a threat to the image of Romania are not progressive in the slightest. In fact, I would describe them as regressive, reactive. That is not a progressive attitude to want to protect an image of a country. Okay? There's nothing progressive about it. Across the world, descendants of enslavers have been uncomfortable in accepting the truth of their forefathers as oppressors. Accepting the ancestors' legacy may be complicated. Thus, instead, many descendants of enslavers hurry to justify the structural inequalities and wealth gaps that the descendants of enslaved people face today through race and cultural prejudice. Damn nation state, it's always its fault. That is true that nation states have had a hand in making things worse. But keep in mind, the enslavement of Roma people far predates the creation of nation states. We have to keep this in mind, that the enslavement of the Roma people predates the existence of nation states. In the case of the Roma, the construction of the racecraft of Roma criminality, I'm not going to use the word, Yeah, I was referring to the cleaning up the history of the state. Yeah, that's true. That's true. That is absolutely true, Ilian Sarani. An idea made up during slavery has constituted a central justification for anti-Roma racism. In Poland, this also persists about Roma theft and homelessness. More so, progressive politicians, bureaucrats, and scholars have long focused the public discourse on what they see as Roma backwardness. So let me explain. Roma backwardness is things like the traditional lifestyle of the Roma, especially when it's a traveling lifestyle. It's basically Roma people not being good citizen drones in a nation state, to be quite brutally honest. It must be more comfortable for them to address Roma integration, enrollment in primary education, poverty, and vulnerability than to directly tackle the problem and then anti-Roma racism. And let me just say that in our current world of the European Union with open borders and many other things that were possible due to the Schengen zone, I don't think it's impossible to accommodate a Roma traveling lifestyle. That is just my personal opinion. In my opinion, it's more than possible to accommodate the Roma lifestyle in our modern world. No, that is not the type which we're talking about. Oh, I forgot to share the thing. There we go. The message. Also, press like on the stream and do all that other stuff that you usually do. I forgot to share the thing on the Discord and stuff. So I'm gonna quickly do that now. Oh, Karas has done it. Okay. So, but the agenda of Roma integration is not enough for us anymore. We now demand justice, reparations, and anti-racist policies. Good. It is as it should be, at least on the demanding part. For half a millennium, our ancestors were coerced into grueling, uncompensated labor. And it is self-evident that the history of 500 years of economic exploitation stripped Roma people of any prospect of accumulating intergenerational wealth. A large portion of the wealth gap in Romania stems from this little-known history of economic exploitation. The forced labor of Roma slaves constituted a central element in the development and growth of the Romanian economy. It was a critical source of wealth for the Romanian state, the Orthodox Church, and the aristocracy. Let us take, for example, the case of Orthodox Church properly. Many of its churches and monasteries have been built using the free highly skilled Romani workforce. Highly skilled, keep that in mind. For instance, the Kazin monastery in Baka was built in the 1650s by 800 Romani slaves. Should the Orthodox Church not pay back the Roma for having built Kazin and other properties from scratch? The answer is yes. Yes, it absolutely should. The aristocracy also accumulated wealth through the enslavement of Roma people. In the village where I grew up, there was still dependency and a culture of respect for boyars, landowners. And during my childhood, people were still using the term boyari. In fact, my mother's sister once hinted at our past. I asked her why she never went to school when she was a child in the 1940s. She looked at me like the answer was obvious and said, I was working on the lands of the boyars. In 1906, her grandparents, my great-grandparents Maria Nicolae and Marian Gita, were still identified in their marriage certificate as emancipated Romanians, which in the language of those times meant former Romani slaves. They themselves were not slaves, as the enslavement ended in 1855, but their parents had been. The term emancipated remained in the books for 2 to 3 more generations after the abolition. Thus, what Romanians perceive today as a distant past is very much a legacy of dispossession and dishonor, which still affects many Romani families today. Which also bears a striking similarity between Roma people and the situation in the US, would you not say? A long legacy of slavery and discrimination which effects we can feel today. Along with exploitation, as expert Orlando Patterson argues in his book, Slavery and Social Death, a comparative study, Honor, Alienation, and Social Death, the denial of slaves' humanity by society, are equally important in understanding slavery and its legacy. And the Romanian enslavers did see and treat Romani enslaved people a little bit better than animals. The Roma had no alternative to enslavement, humiliation, and dishonor. Their only options were death or escape. The enslavers imposed their power over Romani slaves not only through laws and church regulations, but also by misrepresenting the Roma as outsiders, criminals, inferiors, and non-persons. Hiding, ignoring, or neglecting slavery and its legacy is not, however, just a matter of failing to understand the past. Forgetting, distorting, and erasing the past have always been powerful tools in the hands of oppressors and their descendants in all corners of the world. And that is also a big reason why Florida is trying to change the way children are educated about slavery in the US. Keep that in mind. It is a powerful tool indeed. Gigglers, what is happening? We are talking about the enslavement of the Roma people. 500 years of Roma people slavery. But the time has come to remember the past and correct the present through reparations and power sharing. It is time for descendants of enslaved people across the world to rise in solidarity and demand compensation and justice. It is time for governments to not only hear their pleas and compensate them, but also apologize, engage in truth-telling processes, and memorialize resistance. Which, again, in the US, the opposite is happening. Florida and its change in education. And this is the author, Margaret Matacha, a justice activist and scholar from Romania. She is a lecturer on social and behavioral sciences at the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Harvard Th School of Public Health. So this is what the situation with which we are faced. A people is enslaved. After many years of exploitation, the population is freed, and the slavers get reparation, or rather the slavers get compensation for their loss, quote unquote. And in the case of Roma people, the history of their suffering is swept under the rug and forgotten. And we must not forget about it. We must all remember about the history of the enslavement of the Roma people. And more importantly, as Margareta Matacha has said, it is time for the descendants of enslaved people across the world to rise in solidarity and demand compensation and justice for everyone. For Roma people, of course you can ask a host of questions on Jer, and it is live. For Roma people, for Black people, for indigenous people, we all need solidarity. We all do. International, global solidarity. And keep in mind, this article mainly describes what happened in Romania, but the discrimination against Roma people is a problem across Europe. We have another video. I apologize, this video's audio might be a little bit rough, but I still think it is a very important video to watch. So we're gonna watch it now. Nobody's free until everybody's free. Nobody dances until everybody dances. True. Roma Slavery History, Legacy, Reparations by Dr. Margareta Matacha. So this is a video by the same person whose article we have just read. Let us listen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Magda Matake, and I'm a justice.
Margareta Matake. It seems like I've been mispronouncing the surname. I recently saw a couple of shows on a streaming service that had the G word in the title. Is this hurting this community? Are they pygmies? Can you elaborate? Can you elaborate? Because the Digi word is considered a derogatory term now. But can you elaborate on what was the show? What was the show about? What were the people in it saying? I think there's a very important element to that, you know? If you could elaborate on the thing a bit more.
Scholar and activist from Romania. I'm a Harvard instructor and I also work with...
I'm sorry about the audio quality of the video, but I think this video is so important that we should watch it even though it has some audio issues, you know? Have been shows here in the States that use that word, but it's also important for me to know what those shows depict, what they say, what is the tone of the shows, reality shows. Can you elaborate on them a bit further? But it feels to me like they could be a big disservice to the community, yes.
The FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University as the director of the Roma.
I think I will turn on the subtitles as well.
Program. I'm also a descendant of Romani slaves. My research and teaching focus on the history and manifestations of anti-Romani racism and the global history of race and racism. In this lecture, I will discuss the history of Roma slavery in the territories of present-day Romania and the tactics that enslavers used to justify this system of exploitation and domination.
So this video should answer all of the questions that people had about the exact reasons of this thing, or at least the excuses that were used to justify the enslavement.
I will engage with the global scholarly literature on slavery and reparations through a Romani lens, suggesting possible ways to heal and ensure reparations for the harm of Roma enslavement. Instances of Roma slavery have been documented in other parts of Europe and in the transatlantic slave trade. But
see, Roma enslavement became part of the transatlantic slave trade as well.
For this presentation, I'm narrowing my remarks to focus on the history of Roma slavery in Romania. To begin, I suggest that in discussing slavery as a concept and practice, we examine it beyond the conventional legal construct of ownership or property. Thus, I will unpack slavery as both an institutional process and a personal relation. Slavery was
so two main pillars of slavery.
Omnipresent throughout history in all corners of the world. In societies including ancient Greece, Enlightenment Europe, or colonial North America, slavery...
And yes, the country which I often talk about, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, of course, had its own form of slavery as well. It was called Pańszczyzna, and it was the relationship between the nobility and the peasant estate. Peasants in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were treated as basically non-human and worked as slaves.
Slavery existed and flourished in parallel with the birth of doctrines on human virtues and on the rights and equality of all people. And throughout the history of slavery, we can see that enslavers, ideologies, laws, and practices portrayed and acted upon slaves both as non-humans or objects.
Non-humans or objects, or to be more specific, property. People treated as property.
And as persons who are legally and
have a non-Roma friend who used the G word for himself as a synonym for being a nomad living all over the place. I told him it was a slur. He said it wasn't because he was using for himself. That's not how that works, I'm afraid. That is not how that works. I think we all understand that this is not how it works, right?
Morally accountable. Enslavers saw no paradox in denying the humanity of slaves by exploiting and abusing them as non-persons, and at the same time accounting for slaves as persons in law to respond to what the law and enslavers considered illegal and immoral acts by the slaves. Moreover, some categories of Romani slaves were also required to pay a so-called gypsy tax. In fact, there was no clash between these contradictory principles of treating slaves both as non-humans and as persons in law, because along with other tactics, this set of practices helped enslavers maintain not only total power over slaves, but also the condition of slavery.
Right.
Furthermore, along with the enslavers, many other categories of people, philosophers, artists, writers, churches, and scientists contributed to creating false moral, philosophical, scientific, and legal justification to legitimize slavery, the denial of humanity.
And keep in mind, the legacy of this philosophy radiates throughout Europe to this day, and it's the result of this is that in Europe many people view Roma people as lesser, as to be discriminated against openly and proudly and treated as normal.
And the refusal to apply virtues and rights for enslaved peoples. In looking at Roma slavery as an institutional process, we should start by examining, but also by distinguishing between the origins and the sources of slavery. In
Right.
other words, how did Romani people become slaves in the first place? And how did the enslaver acquire Romani slaves throughout the 5 centuries of enslavement? Orlando Peterson suggested 8 mechanisms through which people become enslaved. They are capturing warfare.
Right. So conquest, slavery through conquest. In the past, that was a very common way of people acquiring slaves.
Kidnapping, tribute and tax payment, debt, punishment for crimes, abandonment and sale of children, self-enslavement, and birth. Scholars of Romani history do not agree on the way that Roma enslavement originated in the principalities of Moldova and Wallachia. What we do know is that the first written attestation of Roma slavery in these territories appeared 635 years ago.
Right.
In October 1385, Dan I, the Prince of Wallachia, gifted the assets of the then closed Vodica monastery to Tismana monastery. Those assets, which has been donated to Vodica in the early 1370s by Prince Vladislav I, included 40 Romani families.
So, we have already here a documentation of 40 Romani families being gifted as assets to an institution.
This written record leads us to a source, a means of acquiring slaves, but not to the origins of Roma slavery. Some of the existing theories suggest that the original mechanisms for enslaving Roma was capture in warfare. It's not surprising that historians chose that explanation. In early medieval Europe, many of those enslaved were prisoners of war, or were kidnapped, or victims of pirates. Alexandru Gonta and other historians argued that when the Romanians were victorious in battles against the Tatars, who
Right.
invaded the Romanian principalities in the 1200s, the Romanians captured Roma from the Tatars and then put them into slavery.
Right.
On the other hand, Nicolae Gheorghe suggested that Roma had already been slaves of the Tatars when the Romanians captured them in war and continued to keep them enslaved. And Nicolae Gheorghe emphasized that in 1471, Stefan the Great, the Prince of Moldova, brought 17,000 Roman slaves as
Oh.
captives after a victory against Wallachia.
So basically, we don't know the origins. Because Roma people might have already been slaves before the slavery in Romania even started. They were captured already as slaves from the enemy.
Yet importantly, he does not embrace the idea that slavery originated with capture in warfare. Instead, he argues that when Roma arrived on the territories of the two principalities, they were free people. But a century
I don't
later,
know why, but I sort of think that this explanation is more likely that Roma people arrived in those areas and they were free people when they arrived. That is the theory that I'm leaning towards. You are in such poor condition that you put yourself into slavery to have basic needs met at usually the bare minimum. Right. Right, yeah. That's true, yeah.
social and economic conditions led enslavers to force the Roma into slavery.
I think that is
And
what
indeed,
happened.
Romani people were not members of the dominant population in Wallachia who might be taken as prisoners of war. The 17,000 Romani people may have not been considered prisoners of war or human beings, but rather non-persons, commodities, or goods to be confiscated upon victory.
Right.
And slavery had been documented in both Moldova and Wallachia since the 14th century. Thus, this example shows us one way that slaves were acquired and moved from one principality to another. An earlier historian, Petre Panaitescu, also argued that Roma were enslaved because of a critical need for labor, especially specialized labor such as blacksmithing, which some Romani groups had mastered. Other theories, especially those of Viorela Kim and Petre Pescut, prompt us to search elsewhere for the origins of Roma enslavement. Viorela Kim agrees that the institution of slavery was adopted in the Romanian principalities from the Tatars.
So a big part of the enslavement of the Roma people was their specialized skills that were desperately needed.
And eventually the Romanians implemented it against the Tatars they captured in battle. But he argues that when Roma arrived in the Romanian principalities later in the 14th century as newcomers, outsiders, and nomads, they were also pulled into the existing system of slavery. And as the number of Tatars was very small in the 15th century, the Roma remained the only enslaved people. Petre Pescut argues that the Orthodox Church...
So at first, Roma people were put in an existing structure of slavery, but as the numbers of other slaves dwindled, Roma people became the slave population.
Played a crucial role in what he calls the birth of the institution of slavery in the Romanian principalities. Having accepted donations of huge estates in the 14th century, the church addressed its workforce needs by taking advantage of the Roma status as a people who were highly skilled but were newcomers, outsiders, and not Christians. In Europe, the Christian church already had an established practice and tradition of enslaving various peoples. So Petcuți's theory may build on that piece of history. He also shows that before the Roma arrived in the principalities, peasants who had worked for 12 years on a property would gain more status. So perhaps enslavers could have used promises or similar treatment to influence or trick the Roma into enslavement.
Right, they would say, come work for us with your specialized knowledge, and if you work long enough, your status within the system will increase.
Argues that when small groups of Roma started to cross the Danube to Wallachia in the 14th century, the crown and the nobility would immediately enslave them. In the Romanian principalities, we can distinguish three types of enslavers: the crown and later the state, the Orthodox Church, and the nobility.
Right.
Respectively, we can see three categories of slaves. It is not clear which of these enslavers originated the Roma enslavement, but Achim,
I would suspect it was the crown or the nobility.
Suggested that at first the prince must have been the only enslaver.
Right, so the crown. Right, yeah.
And of course, at various times, some free Roma also self-enslaved by selling themselves in times of hunger or other great difficulties.
See, this is the explanation of the self-enslavement. Hunger and desperation led people to sell themselves into slavery.
Pressure. But if we focus on the theories of Gheorghe, Juvara, and Petcuț, we could argue that the origins of Roma enslavement may not fit exactly into Orlando Peterson's list of original means of enslavement. So we may need a new category in the list. Could we add deceit or coercion of newcomers who are non-white and non-Christian? And can we add power and a political project targeting a people newly arrived in a given territory? Similar to the situation in other parts of the world, ethnic Romanians must have been reluctant to enslave other ethnic Romanians. This made the Roma the obvious choice as a people who were neither white nor Christian. Plus, race and culture prejudice made it easier to justify enslaving them. Thus, as we consider ethnic distinctiveness or race as a factor in determining the condition and treatment of slaves, we should also consider it as a factor in people's reasoning for enslavement, as one of the original reasons for enslaving Roma. And therefore, when discussing the history of anti-Romani racism, we have to start with this political project justified through culture and race prejudice. In this sense, we have to understand anti-Romani racism not in the ways in which dominant majorities view Roma or so-called gypsies, but as a political project, as Francisco Bettencourt would call it,
of course,
and a system of oppression and domination imposed through power and justified through race and cultural prejudice. Now let me turn to the sources of...
And once again, I have to say that this is a Europe-wide problem, not just a Romania problem. One show is called The Secret of Life. The description reads, explore the lives of communities in this documentary, the rituals, the history, and the families that inhabit them. It has the tag of edifying and documentary. I don't know the programs, so I cannot comment, but I'm not gonna lie, the description does not sound good. But maybe it's not a bigoted program. Who knows? I have to learn more about it.
Slavery and how enslavers acquired Romani slaves throughout the 500 years of enslavement. By law, the enslavers owned the slaves as their property or possession. And any
Assets.
slaves without a master would become the property of the crown. One major source of Roman slaves was the children born to enslaved parents. This was true in the majority of slaveholding societies.
Right.
In both Moldova and Wallachia, children became slaves at birth. As Delia Grigore describes, the fact of slavery at birth had a very significant impact on Romani women and girls. Called breeding females, they were seen as tools to increase the number of slaves. Children born of one free
Thank you for bringing this into my attention.
person and one slave were also to be enslaved. And enslaved children were separated from their parents when they were sold or donated, sometimes
That is sadly how slavery is conducted. I'm pretty sure it was the same in the US, right?
through slave fairs, to be exploited as laborers. But over time, especially starting in the 17th century, when written laws became more common, the enslavers imposed a variety of rules, laws, and taxes. Along with political and economic context and external influences, different laws and regulations impacted the way in which Romani slaves were acquired. For instance, starting in 1785 in Moldova, the law stipulated that a child born of one free person and one slave would be freed at birth. Furthermore, when enslavers were selling or donating Romani children, the law forbade them to separate the children from their families. In the 1830s, both principalities prohibited legal unions between free persons and slaves, but children born from such marriages were freed. And in the Roma
Interesting.
case, up until 1856, when the final act of abolition was adopted, enslavers used skilled Romani slaves as a form of living currency, as well as private possessions, as they would sell, auction, gift, punish, torture, and abuse them. In the Romanian principalities, monasteries and nobility often acquired slaves through donations or gifts from the crown. The boyars gifted slaves to monasteries too, and in turn, the crown could confiscate slaves from these loyal boyars. But the crown would decide on the possession and allocation of slaves. Less commonly, the enslavers also organized slave fairs, where Romani families were dispersed through the sale of individual members. Still other methods were used to sell slaves. In an 1841 publication, a Swiss author wrote, "Slavery is the country's greatest shame, a black stain in front of foreigners. Will you dare to count yourselves among the civilized people as long as..."
Slavery is the country's stain. Donated, that's right. People were treated as property, as assets.
It is possible to read in your newspapers for sale a young gypsy woman. The price of Romani slaves varied across time and depended on economic and social factors. The price of male and female slaves, as well as children, differed too. Petre Pescut calculated that from 1593 to 1653, male slaves generally fetched a higher price than female and child slaves did. And Orlando Peterson discussed how across slaveholding societies, slaves functioned as multifunctional money, understood as units of accounting or a standard of value, a method of payment, a medium of exchange, or a way to store wealth. And indeed, enslavers used Romani slaves as money. They treated them like any other valuable or possession and used them to make donations or to pay debts or mortgages. They also exchanged them for goods such as wine or animals. In 1689, as Adrian Furtună documents, an enslaver justified the sale of a Romani child as follows. Because we needed a horse, we bought it from him with the money he gave us for the child who should remain property.
This is very interesting. I do want to sort of contrast this with the. Okay, we'll get to it. We will get to it.
Of Marco.
Yep, currency. The Jewry is an odd one. It feeds into the concept of being forgotten. In my country, almost known about Roma people is based on media, therefore have no idea what the word is as a slur. It is also very interesting because in many European countries, the G word or the C word is. There are two there are two sort of pictures that people have about the Roma people when they think about them in Europe. One is the historical, romanticized view of Roma people who were those musicians that traveled around and entertainers and great dancers. And on the other hand, there is the modern view of Roma people as homeless, thieves, and criminals. And people don't really see any jarring between this romanticized view of the past and this bigoted view of the present, if that makes sense.
And his sons. They also used slaves as dowries and as offerings to churches to have a sin forgiven and as gifts in memory of someone who had died. To conclude this section, I would like to emphasize that slavery constituted a central element in the development and growth of the Romanian economy. It was a critical source of wealth for the Romanian state, for the Orthodox Church, and for the Romanian aristocracy. Indeed, the forced labor of Romani people was massive. In fact, the institutions further used the process of abolition to ensure that Romani people, especially blacksmiths, stayed where they had been, as they were an irreplaceable and unique workforce.
So keep in mind, this is slavery of very specialized workforce, which is very interesting because there are examples of countries approaching this in a different way, and we will get to it after the video, I promise.
And so a large portion of the wealth gap in Romania stems from this history of economic exploitation, though little is known about it. Its effects on the Romanian...
I told you, Roma people are on one hand forgotten, but on the other hand, very discriminated against.
Roma have not been well researched, as most quantitative research has focused on income poverty and multidimensional poverty. I would now like to turn to the condition of Roma slavery, particularly the relationship between enslavers and enslaved. We want to know, as Orlando Peterson put it, and I quote, how slaves adjusted to their masters and to their new condition, and how masters use their power in the relationship with the slave. Race played a relevant role in determining the condition and treatment of slaves. One of the most valued books on slavery, entitled Slavery and Social Death by Orlando Peterson, examined 55 slaveholding societies and emphasized that 21% of them involved enslavers and enslaved people belonging to different racial groups. In the Romanian territories, the origins and skin color of the Roma made it possible to distinguish them as non-Romanians and non-Christians, vital elements in enslavement. And enslavers did justify the condition and the inhumane treatment of slaves to the racecraft of Romani criminality and inferiority. As Adrian Furtună documents, in the 18th century, Dimitrie Cantemir wrote this about Romani slaves. They have the same aspects and customs as the gypsies from other countries. Their most important characteristics, and what distinguishes them from others are idleness and robbing. Thus, this currently widespread racist idea that gypsies are deceitful or criminal.
This is a thing that exists in Poland as well. This idea that Roma people will steal and that they don't want to work as well. I'd assume over time that the concentration of highly skilled Roma people has dwindled due to the treatment they have been subject to. Not exactly, because they have been enslaved for their specialized knowledge. So I assume this specialized knowledge was cultivated while slavery was in place. I think it is a European stereotype. You think correctly. That is correct.
Also has deep roots in the past of anti-Romani racism. It was already documented in 1639 in the name of a Wallachian village, Țiganească, a name derived from Țigan, a racial slur, and also a synonym for slaves in the Romanian
Polish has a very similar word, the C word.
Principalities. The Țiganească village gained that name because Romanian peasants, like enslaved Roma, had run away from exploitation and abuse. Thus, escaping exploitation was conveniently for enslavers considered a Romani criminal act. Escaping exploitation contributed to the present idea of Romani criminality. But looking beyond race at the condition of slavery, we can observe that enslavers had total power in the relationship with Romani slaves. Enslavers had the power to treat and punish slaves as they wanted, although the law prohibited them from killing Roma. However, as the French journalist Felix Colson wrote upon traveling to slaveholding Romania, slaves were, and I quote, often shot through the head and flogged to death upon any cause or no cause without the murder being noticed.
Right, it's basically people being executed as an exercise of power. There are many rich Roma, they're not all poor. You will see some neighborhoods where all the nice and pioneer houses are owned by Roma.
For he is only a Tigoriner. Gender also contributed to the conditions of slaves. As in other slaveholding societies, enslavers had power over female slaves, leading...
It is true that wealthy Roma people exist, but they are more like an exception to the rule than the rule, if that makes sense.
...to rape and abuse. As Colson wrote in his journal...
After all, the existence of rich black people does not change the fact of a systemic poverty problem caused by historical reasons existing, right?
Documented by Ian Hancock, in the evening, the master makes his choice among the beautiful girls. Maybe he will offer some of them to the guests. While Romani women were used as sexual objects, some Romani men were castrated by their enslavers. Enslavers often subjected female adolescents to sexual abuse. Delia Grigore and other authors suggest a reason for the practice of early marriage in some Romanian Romani families. Perhaps during slavery, the families arranged for their virgin daughters to marry young as a way to protect them from sexual abuse by the enslavers. Cultural sociologists would call this a cultural or social adaptation to racism or oppression. Enslavers would decide on marriages between slaves or between slaves and serfs, although, as I mentioned earlier, laws sometimes prohibited such unions and regulations varied across time. For instance, in a deed written in 1674 and published by Adrian Furtună, a Romanian woman...
Very interesting dates I'm seeing here. And I will... Okay,
marrying a Romani slave declared, I, Dina, gave my deed to the Holy Cross to be known that by taking Fiera, a gypsy of Vale monastery, into marriage with my free will, I willingly and without any constraint became the slave of the Holy Cross monastery. I also promised with my good will and without any constraint that all my children I would have shall belong as slaves to the Holy Cross Monastery. The category of slaves also determines the condition of slavery. In the Romanian principalities, various criteria were used to distinguish between slaves. One was the difference between sedentary and nomadic slaves. Nomadic slaves were allowed to travel, but were bound to enslavers by obligations and taxes. Slaves were also distinguished as slaves of the crown and later of the state, slaves of the church and slaves of the boyars. Historians argue that the slaves of the crown were treated better than those in the other categories.
Interesting.
And slaves of the church, who were servants or craftsmen, may have been treated better than slaves on estates in villages. But perhaps we cannot conclude that one category of slaves was always treated better than another. As Peterson shows, various factors may have contributed to the development of different types of relationships between enslavers and enslaved people. It was important, for instance, where the slaves lived, whether they were bought or born in the residence of the enslavers, their proximity to enslavers, and the personality of enslavers. For instance, where the slaves lived could have functioned as a source of either strength or weakness, depending on the enslaver. Skills and crafts also played a part in determining the condition of Romani slaves. Manual slaves, such as blacksmiths or locksmiths, seem to have been valued more and treated better. The hypothesis could
It's the same here in the state. Most people have no idea that the word refers to a historically marginalized ethnic group.
Could be connected with Panaitescu's theory that some value was put on such skills given the lack of specialized blacksmith labor in the Romanian principalities. And that was not unique to Roma slavery. As Peterson points out, Greece also relied a lot on skilled craftsmen for its urban industries, and this fact, more than any other, determined the character of Greek slavery. And finally, Romani people themselves were not totally passive about their condition. They adapted, strategized, or reacted to the condition of slavery in different ways.
Well, yeah, of course. That's because as much as the slavers tried to pretend that the enslaved were not human, they in fact were human. And humans adapt and plan and do things when enslaved. Of course.
Given the time limitation, I will only mention the revolt of the Netoci Roma. They were semi-nomadic Roma who escaped their enslavers and moved into the Carpathian Mountains. But in the times of slavery, those who resisted enslavement were portrayed as the worst kind of Roma, and also incapable of adapting, as Giulietta Rotariu would mention. In the 19th century, Alexandru Paspati described Netoci as, and I quote, half savage, half naked, living by theft and rapine, feeding in times of want upon cats, dogs, and mice. They are the most degraded and debased of all gypsy population. Yet the Romani scholar Ian Hancock described them as the true heroes of the enslaved Romani people. Finally, in looking at slavery as an
It's almost like they don't want to be slaves, right?
institutional process, I like to mention a few methods of manumission or circumstances in which Romani slaves could gain their freedom. There are very few records of Romani slaves who were set free, but it was sometimes done through a will. Petre Pescuț gives a few examples. For instance, in May 1634, an enslaver wrote in his will that upon the death of himself and his wife, Marga Tudora and her children should be set free. There are also a few records of slaves set free.
So people were freed in wills of people upon their death.
Due to the good behavior or non-slaves buying the freedom of their enslaved spouses. But not much has been written about the status of those freed people, including their prestige or acceptance in their community, their honor,
We can
or the
speculate
mistreatment.
based on other
And
societies.
having mentioned prestige and honor, let me now move to slavery as a personal relation, which Orlando Peterson describes, and I quote, as the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. He argues that the concept and the practice of property are central in understanding slavery, but honor, alienation, and social debt are equally important. Romani people were coerced into the system of chattel enslavement beginning in the 1370s or perhaps earlier. The enslavers
over 600 years
saw and treated Romani people a little bit better than animals, as an English diplomat visiting Romania during slavery wrote. And throughout the history of Roma enslavement, the enslavers continued the paradoxical practice of using their power over the slaves as objects of property and at the same time treating slaves as persons in law, and more important for this part of our conversations, as persons with moral responsibility or trustful people. Romani women were denied humanity when punished and abused by enslavers, yet seen as trusted beings to breastfeed and raise their children. The enslavers imposed their authority over Romani slaves not only through laws and church regulations, but also by misrepresenting the Roma as outsiders, criminals, inferiors, and non-persons.
Which, keep in mind, some of these things are done to this very day.
That, as defined by Peterson, occurred through representing slaves both as external outsiders and outsiders within. The slave was an external intruder and an internal exile. The Romani slave was treated at the same time as a valuable commodity, a degraded and marginal human being, and an integral part of a household, a person kept in proximity. The historian Mihail Cogălnicianu, the most determined Romanian abolitionist in the 1800s, described the treatment of Romani slaves as follows: cruel beatings and other punishments, such as starvation, being hung over smoking fires, solitary imprisonment, and being thrown naked into the snow or the frozen rivers. Such was the fate of the wretched gypsy. The Roma had no alternative to enslavement, humiliation, and dishonor in the form of being subject with property, dignity, and integrity. Their only options were death.
It is. It is very good. And it's very informative. It is important for us to watch videos like this.
And escape. Thus, like other examples Peterson provides in Slavery and Social Debt, enslavers had complete power over Romani slaves. But in addition, like many other enslaved peoples, the Roma were also denied humanity and honor. The institution of slavery ended in 1855 in Moldova and 1856 in Wallachia. After the final act of abolition in 1856, the 250.
This is so recent that it's just unbelievable.
1,000 Romani slaves who became legally free, a full 7% of the Romanian population, received no reparations for the inhuman treatment they had suffered. As also happened on other continents, after 5 centuries of exploitation, the abusers received monetary compensation for freeing their Romani slaves. And they benefited further from the legacy of slavery by exploiting the cheap Romani workforce, as many newly freed Roma had to settle and work on the lands of former enslavers. Beyond former abolition, the actual transition from the status of slaves to free people was very slow. For instance, my great-grandparents, Maria Nicolae and Marian Ghiță, married in June 1906 in my village in southern Romania. A full half century after abolition, their marriage certificate stated that they were emancipated Romanians.
Right.
In the language of those times, emancipated Romanians meant former Romani slaves. And the term remained in the books for 2 to 3 more generations after the abolition. Today, Romanians like to think that slavery is something in our distant past. But for my family and many other Romani families in Romania, only the past 3 or 4 generations were not stamped as slaves or former slaves. And to date, reparations for slavery have not been made. And this leads me to the last section of my lecture. In a recent chapter for our Time for Reparations volume, Jacqueline, Baba, and I suggested 8 ways to repair the harm of state-sponsored injustices.
Okay, this is very crucial part. Not just learning about the history, not just reminding the forgotten or rather ignored history of the Roma people, but discussing what can and should be done now.
In the case of Roma enslavement, we suggest 5 forms of reparation.
Okay, let's go.
Truth-telling, memorializing resistance,
yes,
apology, compensation, and reform at the legal, policy, cultural, political, and economic level. We intentionally chose truth-telling as a concept to encompass the broad variety of actions that are needed and possible.
Keep in mind, those 5 steps, in my opinion, are things that could very well also be implemented in the US. Truth-telling being a very important component. Why? Because as I've said before, in the US, certain red states are actively trying to falsify history around slavery. Florida, once again, being a primary example of that happening. And we cannot let that happen.
Possible to ensure memorialization and remembrance. The concept of truth-telling signals the importance of presenting an accurate account of the history without minimizing the experience of enslavement. A simple example would be pointing out that the enslaved were not the same as the peasant serfs. The field of history is supposed to be objective, yes, describing not only war victories and heroes, but also painful episodes like the enslavement.
Exactly.
The truth about Roma slavery is not yet being told. The truth about Roma slavery is not told enough. The truth about Roma slavery is not accurate enough. And the state institutions...
I would go even further. I would say that it's not spoken about at all in real terms. I asked the chat, how many of you have heard of this? How many of you were taught about it? And most of you said, I've never heard about this before. Which suggests to me that it's generous to say that it's not accurate enough or not enough. It's not at all.
And the Orthodox
it's forgotten history. It's ignored history.
Church play a critical role in this memory approach. It is not enough for Roma to remember. It is a matter of injustice for Romanians to forget.
Right.
And I say that not in an effort to remain stuck in the past, but rather to use the past to grieve, heal, accept guilt, draw lessons,
and move forward to a better future. If we cannot accept the painful, the difficult parts of our collective histories, then we can never move forward.
Understand structural inequalities, break racial prejudice, shape the future, and balance power. Several concrete steps towards truth-telling will help to generate broader public awareness, along with better policies and engagement with the history of the enslavement, the enslavers, and the enslaved. revise history textbooks, public.
In fairness, we barely talk about what we did to the indigenous people in my own country, let alone what's been done to others. And that is something that we need to change. That is why we need international solidarity about these things. Right? We need the same level of awareness about the indigenous, the same steps, truth telling, apology, compensation, all of them. We need those for indigenous populations. And we need to push for those things on an international scale.
Publication of complete historical
Necessary.
records, creation of public memorials, the symbolic renaming of.
It's time to throw away the thinking of, in my country, in your country. It's about people's history and people's suffering. And I think it is a thing that affects us all in various degrees, but it does.
Some city landmarks after Romani resistors and victims, and exhibition and other educational activities are needed to generate broader public awareness of and engagement with these issues. Also of vital importance are open, easy, and digital access to archival information about slaves, careful revision of history books, relevant memorials, and public acknowledgement. Incomplete past efforts to address truth-telling, such as the Romanian Commission on Enslavement, need to be reestablished. Romania has to launch a new, independent, Roma-led national commission to study the legacy of the Roma enslavement and propose measures on reparations. Yeah. Equally important is memorializing the resistance of both Romani people and their non-Romani allies. Stories of resistance send a strong message of power, of speaking up and dignity. That is why the stories and history of the Netoci Roma must be researched and told. Another significant element is the role of non-Roma in the resistance and in abolishing enslavement, as well as in fighting other forces.
Did you know that Roma people had an uprising during World War II in Auschwitz?
Of state-sponsored injustices. These stories are relevant because in practice, they can have a lot of influence in convincing other non-Roma with more access to privileged and power spaces to join the fight against racism. The participation and support of non-Roma in fighting injustice should be a moral responsibility of our common societies. Romanian state institutions and the Orthodox Church have failed to issue a formal apology for the history of enslavement.
Right.
Apologies should be done in a straightforward manner by expressing regret, requesting forgiveness, acknowledging and admitting.
There has to be regret, of course. That is also an important ingredient that has to be there. There needs to be that regret.
The harm and accepting responsibility. And it is self-evident that the history of 500 years of economic exploitation stripped Romani people of any prospect of accumulating intergenerational wealth. Thus, the state and the church have a responsibility to mitigate that wealth gap. Also, for 5 centuries, Roma were coerced into forced, uncompensated labor. For instance, the Cașin monastery in Bacău was built in the 1650s by 800 Romani slaves. Thus, we suggest the state provide compensation in the form of money and land to the descendants of Romani slaves, and also make collective financial compensations in a variety of other forms, including housing, healthcare, education and scholarship, research, and funding for the arts. Finally, legal, social, cultural, and economic reforms are needed to reduce the legacy of enslavement and ensure an anti-racist approach and preventive measures to forestall further harm. To conclude my lecture, I would like to leave you with an old Romani saying that Ian Hancock documented in his book Pariah Syndrome. He who wants to enslave you will never tell you the truth about your forefathers. Con mangel te querel tu mendar, roburen.
True. True. Think of that. Think on that saying when you view red states wanting to falsify teaching history. Think on it. Think on it deeply and then protest it with all your strength.
Ciso hapene la tu men o chachimos patumare peritonde. Thank you very much. Nice to get.
Amazing video. I actually going to link it in the chat. So, I want to actually, because as a streamer with a focus on history, I wanted to do a little bit of a comparison to how I've touched upon this a little bit. We're going to go into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth period for a bit, which happened in a similar period as the slavery in Romania, the so-called Polska Roma in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Because this dynamic feels a bit different, which I find very interesting and speaks to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a union between the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, or rather was. It was a composite state with a very specific political system ruled by the nobility and an elected king. So in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, between the 16th and 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, like other European states, passed anti-Roma legislation. However, unlike in most European countries, these laws were rarely enforced in large measures because the Roma found powerful protectors among the Szlachta, Polish nobility, and benign neglect. The nobles, magnates, and landowners placed a high value on the traditional crafts of the Roma, such as metallurgy, farming, and wheel writing, as well musical skills, which became a standard staple of important occasions. The Polska Roma were usually exempted from feudal restrictions that tied Polish peasants to the land. This is crucial, okay? Because it signifies that Roma people within the Commonwealth were treated better than peasants. They were free to continue the nomadic lifestyle during most of the year as long as they arrived in the hometown, quote unquote, on pre-specified marked days. In that respect, the Polska Roma occupied social strata above that of the Polish peasants and other Roma populations such as Carpathian Roma, whose mobility was restricted. In many large magnate latifundia, which was the name of the estates of the nobility, the communities of Polska Roma were also given the right to have a king chosen to represent them in legal disputes with outsiders. However, over time the office became a source of corruption. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the persons were often chosen from outside their group and tended to pursue personal rather than community interests. Additional anti-Roma laws were passed in Poland and Lithuania when Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony, was elected King of Poland in 1697. Saxony, like most German states of the time, had very strong anti-Roma legislation. Roma men were to be killed on sight, often with a bounty paid for their ears, while Roma women and children were disfigured, branded, and banished. And upon Augustus' inauguration, some of these laws were transferred to the Commonwealth. However, a distinction was made between the laws applicable in Augustus' home state of Saxony and the Commonwealth proper, where the most severe measures were mitigated into monetary fines or simply benign neglect of local authorities. So those horrible laws were basically not they were not done. They were not executed. They were not put into practice in the Commonwealth. Shortly before the partitions of Poland, Polska Roma, like other non-szlachta classes, were granted full citizenship by the Constitution of 3rd May. However, these privileges were lost with the partitions, and the Polska Roma were forced back into servile status by foreign powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia. So this, I guess this was a little bit of a dive into a different status that Roma people held in comparison to places like Romania when they were outright enslaved. What do you think? How are we feeling about the topic? Do you think it's important? Do you feel like you've learned something new about the Roma people that you did not know before? Would you be interested in more segments on my channel about Roma history? And because what is also important to know that in many respects historically, the Roma population and the Jewish community were close together. When my mom went to sell her paintings in Sweden in the 70s, she said that the Jewish community and the Roma community often spent a lot of time together doing various activities and basically just being together. They're in this form of solidarity between these two groups. And it's also important that some Roma people were locked together with Jewish people in the ghettos during World War II. All right. I think I've got one last thing before we move on. One last page. Provided to me by a wonderful person. There you go. One last thing before we move on from the topic. Definitely learned some stuff that needed to be talked about more. Thank you. Let's go here. Wallachia and Moldavia. The history of Roma migration into Europe was abruptly brought to a halt for those Roma who arrived in the Romanian territories of the southern and eastern Carpathian Mountains. Roma who arrived in Wallachia and Moldavia in the second half of the 14th century. This is interesting because in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Carpathian Roma people were mentioned, that they were forced to settle. And it seems that they were forced to settle into slavery. Roma people shall be born only slaves. Anyone born of a slave mother shall also become a slave, stated the Code of Wallachia at the beginning of the 19th century. 19th century. That was not a long time ago. It was not a long time ago at all. Bill of sale for a group of Roma slaves in 1558. Stefan Razvan Rom and Lord of Moldavia. Settlement in Romania, freedom and slavery. This is also a pretty important document. I will link it in a moment. How was slavery possible? A local custom required free peasants who had worked on a feudal estate for 12 years to become serfs. Romani of the boyar. There is reason to believe that the Roma were treated similarly. Another equally important aspect is the weakness of the state in the face of the authority of the nobility. The sovereign could not exercise effective authority throughout the country in order to keep his own slaves under his direct influence. The Roma were forced into slavery by local masters. The existence of Roma slaves in Wallachia and Moldavia underwent the most spectacular reversals with changes in the master's financial situation. Selling slave was the most convenient way of repaying debts or redeeming oneself from Turk or Tatar slavery. Slaves were good for anything, equivalent to any value sold, given as wedding presents or dowries gifted to the monastery so that the master's name was mentioned during Mass, in exchange for animals or cloth trousers. Should they fail to submit, they should be beaten very hard. Should they fail to submit, they should be beaten very hard. Deeds of emancipation. Freeing slaves through deeds of emancipation was an opportunity for a master to express gratitude for life spent in their service. In the mid-19th century, one such deed of emancipation given to a washerwoman read as follows. I hereby announce that the Roma Mary, daughter of Dumitru Krakow, and a descendant of the slaves I inherited from my parents, widowed by the death of her husband, because she has served with devotion and ardor since she was a child, growing up in my court, putting her heart into the task such that she has always attracted my gratitude and that of my wife. Through this deed which I place in her hands, I absolve her from slavery and allow her to go whenever and wherever she likes. For as long as she wishes to remain in my court, she shall, without any hindrance, be entitled to the room she inhabits and her rations, just like all the other slaves living in the court. This will set an example for her son, Dinka, too, who, if she behaves as well as his mother, will be freed in due course. Dated the 8th day of June, 1849, Dimitri Kanta Lagothete. Well, here we are. Here we are indeed. I'm going to link this whole document into the chat. And now, as I've been advised by the owner of this channel, I am going to take you all and I'm going to direct you into my channel where we will continue talking about topics of various import. Let me see how to do this. Let me see. How do I do this? How do I do this? Do you know how to raid into someone? Uh, um, where is it? Oh, it is? Hold on. Oh my god. All right, redirect. There you go. I've added. Okay. So I guess I have to now one moment. I have to do this like the okay. I think. So now I have to finish this stream, right? And it'll redirect? Or do I have to start the stream first? Do you know? How do I do this? Do you know? Okay. So, stats, thing, live. Okay, I'm gonna start it, I guess. And then end this one. This is so complicated. Okay. Copy. I cannot. Okay, I have to finish this one. Oh wait, no, never mind.